Jim Key and Bill Key horse story and enjoying it so much. Here's another one. This one involves a film I made about a woman who tells a story that's really hard to believe, but it's true. I'm going to prove it's true after you watch this clip. Her name is Nettie Mitchell. The time is the 1970s. She's nearly 90, and she's a reporter in the small little town of Maine, Fayette, Maine. And she tells kind of gossip and stuff like that. And I'm doing a series for television of people who I call independent Americans, people who do things their own way, who don't listen to the government particularly, and don't listen to their neighbors particularly, and tell stories. And Nettie Mitchell is one of the people I've chosen. And I go to Maine, and I'm filming the story, which is a story of Nettie reporting on local events, a baby contest, and she's just great. Great old woman, beautiful personality. Comes to the last day and the last moment, and we take a photograph of the crew with Nettie, and I'm going to leave. And then he says, David, I have a story to tell you, and she kisses me on the lips. And I was shocked. Pay attention, David, I have a story. So I left my cameraman, set up a beautiful scene. She was sitting in her kitchen, and I said, Nettie, you tell the story to Frances. And she tells the story you're about to see. It's one of the most shocking stories I have ever heard. Hard to believe it's true, but it is. Before I run the clip, let me just tell you just a bit about New England at that time. I think it's important. This is Puritan New England. There's cruelty and there's kindness. There's properness and there's things you're not supposed to do, like dance, like have fun. I remember somebody telling me that in Maine, in the Puritan times, you took a moment off from your work, from the chores you had to do when you were sick and dying. That's the only time you took off. There wasn't a lot of joy. I think it was 1816 and 1821. It froze every single day. Nothing grew. I mean, people were starving. These were extremely poor farmers in extremely rough condition in an extremely cold time. And around about 1840, there were these mills down in Massachusetts, the Lowell, Massachusetts woolen mills, thread mills, and they were extraordinary because they were hiring girls and young women to come off the farms, come down, stay in these dormitories, which were safe, they said, and work for a couple of years. The women would keep a portion of the money, and the portion of the money would go back to the farm. It was the first time women had an opportunity like this to make money like this. And Emmeline, the story that you're going to hear, she went down to one of these mills as a girl of about 14. I'll let Nettie tell the rest of the story, and then I'll tell you after what happened as a result of this recording.
I am Nettie Mitchell. I am 89 years of age. I live in the town of Fayette, where I was born and have lived practically all my lifetime. And I would like to tell you one of the saddest and most heartbreaking tales that has come to my notice. Is a true story, something that happened right here in this town in the long ago. I knew this old lady when I was a tiny child, and she was very sweet and lovely. She was one of a large family of children in a very impoverished home in the early 1800s. At the age of 13, visitors from Lynn, Massachusetts arrived at the home, and seeing the poverty and deprivation there, said, why don't you let us take Emmeline back with us to Lynn, and she can work in the cotton mills. She's old enough to work there. And she can go work in the cotton mills and send you money to help with the expenses back home. They thought it over and decided to let her go, and she went. She was an efficient, hard-working little girl, but she was entirely among strangers in a strange land, very, very different than anything she had ever known before. Among those who were friendly to her, as most of them were not because she was entirely different, was her young boss, a young man, and he became very friendly, and she yielded to him, to his persuasion. And by the time she was 14, she was the mother of his child.
And they lived happily ever after. The end. Now what? Let's talk next steps to getting your manuscript published. The next step is understanding the different paths. Your book needs to go through editing, proofreading, cover design, formatting, distribution, marketing, and many more processes. But what's the best path? Traditional publishing is only accessible to about 1% of writers, typically those with established audiences or enough fame. Self-publishing means doing everything yourself, but that can be overwhelming. Managing the entire process on your own takes time, energy, and lots of learning and making mistakes. Then there are self-publishing companies. They can do all the work for you, but they often charge hefty fees for their services. And nowadays, there are publishing platforms like Spines, which have automated 80% of the process, making it accessible, fast, and simple for all writers and authors.
She did not dare to let her people back home know what had occurred. The people where she was staying made arrangements to sell her baby to a childless couple nearby them who would pay her expenses and pay for her transportation back home if she would go as soon as she was able. She returned to her home, and she worked very hard in the fields and all, but she didn't join very freely in the social life of the community. As she grew older, her parents and others began to wonder why it was that she shunned all the young gentlemen around. She was a very pretty girl, and they couldn't understand it. When she was 21, they began to worry because they thought she's past the first mark and she's going to be an old maid. And they wanted very much for her to marry and have a home of her own. Time went on, and in spite of all the urging of those about her, she kept reticent. And when she was about 30, they began to wonder why it was that she didn't respond to anyone, and she was really an old maid. In her early 30s, while she was working at home, a young man came to town to build highways. And he was a very personable young chap, and he came to board at their home. Although she was so many years older than he fell desperately in love with her, and she with him. And they decided to marry and have a home of their own. They did, and built a little cottage down by the shore of Mosher Pond. They moved in there and had been married something less than a year when his people from Massachusetts decided to come to visit them. They came down, and to their horror, they discovered that he had married his own mother. Of course, when this was revealed, the marriage was annulled, declared broken up, and he reluctantly bade her goodbye and went back with his foster parents to Massachusetts, where he remained for the rest of his life. The indignation of her parents and of the community at the fact that she had had an illegitimate child. She had concealed that fact from them all through these years. It was considered a horrible sin for her to have had the child, and she had married illegitimately, and therefore she was entirely ostracized. Although her home was almost in sight, almost across the highway from that of her mother and her brothers and sisters who still lived there, she was forbidden to enter that home, to go near it at all. None of them ever went to her or spoke to her, and nobody spoke to her. No one went near her except once in a while a kindly friend, a kindly person who would bring her a bit of tea or some little thing. The years went by. She eked out a living by her own efforts, made her gardens, and spaded them with a spade herself, and made them and raised her food as much as possible, and knit and did various things at a very small stipend. But it became necessary for her to become a pauper, which was another disgrace. And she had to call on the town for things for existence. There came a very severe winter, and it was a long time. Of course, in those days, there was no means of letting anyone know what you needed or anything. There was no telephone. There were no RFDs. There was no way of communication. And as she was ostracized and left by herself, no communication was possible for her. Early in the springtime, the mud was very, very deep. One of the Sillick men, who lived in another section of the town, was obliged to go to Chesterville. On his way up, he called at the house, thought he would see how Emmeline was doing. He hadn't heard from her all winter. He knocked on the door, no response. The door was fastened. He thought he heard a moaning sound inside, and desperately he managed to burst the door in. And as he came inside, he saw this form lying on the floor with faint moans. Throughout all these years, she had suffered so terribly, seen her mother's casket carried to the cemetery and without being able to even peep inside it. And all these terrible things had been happening. And now here she lay at death's door. He picked her up carefully and laid her on her bed and went out, turned his horse about, and started for Lamore Falls to get a doctor. On the way, he stopped at one house, stopped at Edward's house, and asked Mrs. Edwards to go over. And she said, I can't possibly, for Will has gone with the horse and I've no way to get there. He went on up to the Dyke home and made the same request, and there the men were away with the horses. My mother was there, and she said, I will go home and harness the horse and go over, and she did. And she found her in this terrible condition with nothing to be found in the house that was of any possible value for diet or anything else. There were a few drops of molasses clinging to the bottom of a jug and a few grains of cornmeal in the corners of a box, and nothing else was there. The poor old lady had starved to death. She perished before the doctor arrived. The sadness of the whole thing. I had been down there as a child, sent many times with a bit of tea and some little things, and I loved the dear old soul. When my mother came home and told us what had happened, I began to cry. A few days later, her funeral was held at Moose Hill Church. She was placed in a wooden box and for a casket, and a simple ceremony was held. And several who would not have spoken to her during her lifetime and ostracized her completely were there at the last. At the close of the ceremony, her sister went to the casket and placing her hand upon it, and her other hand high in the air, she said, "At last she has paid for her sin." That was the tragedy of the climax of the tragedy. And my mother came home so upset and so angry. And really, my mother, although she was a very mild person, said, "I think her sister sinned more than she." She said, this terrible neglect of her through all these years.
Do you think that she sinned?
The sweet little old lady would be so grateful when even a child would come and speak to her at least. Just the silence of all those years. As a little child, a child of 13, away from home in a strange city, with surroundings she had never seen, and only one person being really friendly to her, and she probably had no conception of what the consequences of that association would become. I cannot see that it was truly a sin.
First of all, I want to thank Nettie Mitchell for telling that story and for being so kind to this woman at a time when people were terrible. It's a terrible story. This issue of shunning is really important, I think, to the story. I lived in Maine for 25 years, small town, and I saw people shun people, and I was shunned. Shunning, they don't look at you, they don't talk to you, they make it like you don't exist. It's less violent, certainly, than violence, but it's pretty powerful when the whole town shunned Emmeline. I made a documentary for television called Sins of Our Mothers. There was also a book written called Emmeline by Judith Rossner, whom I made a deal with so she could write the book and interview Nettie and give Nettie some money. Nettie survived the rest of her life, got heating for her house and stuff like that. On the book rights and what happened to that book, there was an opera written called Emmeline, pretty interesting opera. And I have presented clips from this film on my YouTube channel before, but I wanted to tell you how I knew it was true. First of all, my colleagues and I did a huge amount of research in the libraries and the archives in Fayette, and we found there was indeed an Emmeline who lived on Mosier Pond. You could see her name in these diaries, and so the person did exist. But we had to find somebody who knew Emmeline. And sure enough, we find this 97-year-old lady in an old age home who says, "Yes, I knew Emmeline." Some people have asked, did I ever find Emmeline's son's family? I didn't. I don't know that name. I couldn't find that name. So we never did find out what happened to the boy, young man, when he was yanked out of Emmeline's home, yanked out of the marriage, yanked out of Maine, and never heard from again. I love stories like this that have power and emotion and tragedy and comedy and beauty and kindness and cruelty. I want to thank those of you who have been sharing your stories with me as comments and as emails. I don't answer phone calls, and I wish I could record every one of the good ones because they're spectacular. But I know ordinary people are extraordinary and have extraordinary stories to tell, although Emmeline, holy moly, what a story. In any case, thank you for watching. David Hoffman, filmmaker. Bye-bye.
You ate all my pizza rolls.
Totino's pizza rolls are 10 for about $1.
Well, then give us about $1.